June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy are already soaked in blood. Along the shingle and sand of Goal Beach, men of the British 79th Armoured Division push inland through smoke and chaos, past the bodies of those who never made it past the waterline. Somewhere ahead, dug into the Norman hedgerow country, German machine gun positions have survived the naval bombardment. They are waiting. They have always been waiting. Then, lumbering forward through the dust and the din, comes something that does not quite look like any tank the soldiers around it have seen before. Its hull is wider than a Churchill. There is a long arm mounted at its front, almost like the proboscis of some prehistoric insect. And when the order comes and the weapon fires, what emerges is not a shell. It is a column of burning liquid, sustained and roaring, that reaches across 150 meters of open ground and pours itself into the concrete and the sandbag and the flesh on the other side. The screaming stops almost immediately, not because the resistance ceases, because there is nothing left to scream. That weapon was the Churchill Crocodile. It was, without question, one of the most psychologically devastating weapons fielded by any side in the Second World War. It changed the nature of close infantry support in the final years of the conflict, rendered previously impregnable defensive positions into traps for their own occupants, and produced a terror in German soldiers so profound that documented accounts survive of entire garrisons surrendering the moment one was spotted on the horizon. But to understand why the crocodile existed at all, you have to understand the particular and almost intractable problem that preceded it. By late 1942, British military planners were staring at a map of occupied Europe and confronting an uncomfortable truth. The liberation of the continent, when it came, would not be a fluid, open engagement fought across rolling plains. It would be a grinding, methodical assault on some of the most heavily fortified positions that military engineering had ever constructed. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's grand defensive project stretching from Norway to the Pyrenees, represented a philosophy of static defense taken to its extreme conclusion. Reinforced concrete bunkers, some with walls more than 3 meters thick, were designed to absorb direct artillery hits and keep functioning. Smaller field fortifications, pillboxes, and camouflage machine gun nests filled the gaps between the major emplacements. Standard anti-tank rounds could punch through many of them, but a shell that penetrates a pillbox does not necessarily kill the men inside. The concussive effect is unpredictable. The occupants may be stunned, dazed, or entirely uninjured, and as soon as the immediate blast passes, they are firing again. Conventional infantry assaults on such positions carried catastrophic casualty rates. The attack on Dieppe in August 1942, though a failure for many reasons, had demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when troops tried to take heavily defended fixed positions without the right tools. Nearly 60% of the nearly 5,000 Canadians who landed that day became casualties. The lessons were absorbed and catalogued with painful thoroughness by British planners. The question was not whether such positions needed to be destroyed. The question was how to destroy them without feeding men into a grinder. Earlier British experiments with flame weapons were not new. The Livens Large Gallery flame projector had been used at the Battle of Hooge in July 1915, the first large-scale deployment of a flamethrower in the British Army. But those weapons were static, cumbersome, dependent on buried pipe systems, and tactically limited to the particular conditions of trench warfare. A portable, vehicle-mounted system that could project flame across meaningful distances and keep moving through a dynamic battlefield was an entirely different engineering challenge. The weapons that existed by the early years of the Second World War were largely inadequate. The standard infantry flamethrower, the AK-PAK, had a range of barely 27 meters and required the operator to stand in the open to use it. 27 meters on a defended beach or against a fortified hedgerow position was close enough to guarantee the operator would be shot before the weapon had its effect. Something fundamentally different was needed. The solution that emerged from British engineering came out of the Petroleum Warfare Department, established in 1940 and staffed by a combination of military officers, civilian engineers, and specialists from the petroleum industry. The PWD was given a fairly extraordinary brief: to weaponize fire in as many forms as possible. It was responsible for the flame fougasse, the flame barrage system intended to defend British beaches against invasion, and a range of other incendiary technologies. But its most consequential achievement was the development of what would become the Crocodile system, in collaboration with the Lagonda Company and a team working under the direction of engineers who had been studying the mechanical and chemical challenges of projecting viscous liquid fuel over substantial distances. The central insight of the Crocodile was mechanical rather than chemical. Earlier flame systems had struggled with range because they relied on simple propellant pressure to throw liquid fuel, and liquid fuel loses velocity rapidly over distance. What the Crocodile used was a combination of compressed nitrogen gas and a specially formulated fuel mixture with a consistency thicker than standard petrol, sometimes described as resembling thick treacle in its viscosity. This fuel, known as Type C fuel, was produced to a specification that balanced ignition reliability with the ability to remain coherent in flight. A stream of water thrown from a garden hose disperses almost immediately. Type C fuel, under the pressures used by the Crocodile system, remained a cohesive column for the critical duration of its flight. The nitrogen propellant, stored in separate cylinders within the trailer that was the weapon's defining physical feature, drove the fuel forward through a projector mounted in place of the Churchill tank's hull-mounted Bisa machine gun. The trailer itself deserves particular attention. It was a purpose-built unit, roughly 3.4 meters in length and weighing approximately 6.5 tons when fully loaded. It carried approximately 1,800 liters of Type C fuel, stored in interconnected tanks that were armored against small arms fire and shell splinters. The trailer connected to the Churchill tank via a coupling assembly that ran the fuel line beneath the hull of the vehicle, meaning that the operator inside the tank was separated from the fuel supply and not working in proximity to the reservoir itself. This was not merely a comfort arrangement, it was an engineering necessity. Earlier, vehicle-mounted flame systems had placed fuel storage on or very close to the tank, with predictable results when enemy fire found the tanks. The Crocodile's trailer arrangement meant that the carrier vehicle could release the trailer under fire if necessary, abandoning the fuel supply but preserving the tank and crew. In practice, this was rarely done, but the capability mattered as much psychologically as practically. The projector itself had a maximum range in ideal conditions of approximately 150 meters, though effective combat range was typically between 80 and 120 meters, depending on wind conditions. Each burst of approximately 5 seconds consumed around 100 liters of fuel, meaning the trailer provided roughly 80 individual bursts before exhaustion. The flame ignition system used a cordite cartridge igniter, which proved substantially more reliable in wet conditions than earlier electrical systems. The Churchill tank chosen as the carrier was the Mark VII, the most heavily armored of the Churchill variants, with frontal armor of roughly 152 millimeters. This was not incidental. The Crocodile needed to be able to absorb the defensive fire the German garrisons would inevitably direct at it the moment its purpose became apparent. At 40 tons, the Churchill was slow, but speed was not the operational priority. Survivability was. Production of the Crocodile took place primarily at facilities that included the Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, which produced the trailers, while conversion of Churchill tanks to Crocodile configuration was handled at Royal Ordnance factories and specialist vehicle workshops. The exact production figures remain partially subject to classification and document loss, but estimates suggest that somewhere between 800 and 900 crocodile sets were completed before the end of the war, with a significant number being issued to the 79th Armoured Division, the formation specifically created under Major General Percy Hobart to field the specialized armored vehicles that came to be known collectively as Hobart's Funnies. The Crocodile was, alongside the DD swimming tank and the AVRE, one of the most important components of this formation. The first major operational use of the Crocodile came in Normandy in June 1944, and the accounts that survive from both sides of those early engagements are instructive. British infantry commanders noted almost immediately that the weapon produced effects that went well beyond the purely physical destruction of defensive positions that had held against artillery, against mortar fire, against infantry assault, frequently surrendered or were abandoned within seconds of the Crocodile coming into action. A fortified farmhouse in the bocage that might have required a full company assault could sometimes be neutralized by a single Crocodile moving up the approach road and directing a burst through the window apertures. The flames entered every space. They found every corner. There was no position a defender could take inside a building or pillbox that offered protection from burning liquid pushed under pressure through every gap. At the town of Fontenay-le-Pénil in late June 1944, Crocodiles operating in support of the 49th Infantry Division helped clear defended buildings that had resisted direct assault for the better part of a day. Near Caen, in the grinding urban fighting that followed the initial lodgment, Crocodiles worked alongside AVRE demolition vehicles to reduce positions that conventional tanks could not safely approach. Near Le Havre in September 1944, a concentrated use of Crocodiles during Operation Astonia contributed to the relatively rapid fall of a heavily garrisoned port, with the German commander citing the flame tank specifically in his account of the surrender decision. Records of specific individual engagements become sparser and more subject to the normal fog of operational documentation as the campaign moved deeper into Germany, but the pattern of effect is consistent across the testimonies that exist. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth considering what the Germans actually had by comparison. The Wehrmacht had fielded flamethrower tanks since the early years of the war. The Flammpanzer II, a converted Panzer II fitted with twin flame projectors, had been used in the Western Campaign of 1940 and in the early Eastern Front operations. It had a range of approximately 35 meters, carried enough fuel for about 80 short bursts, and was thinly armored against anything heavier than small arms fire. The Flammpanzer III, introduced in 1943 and based on the Panzer III hull, improved on this substantially, extending range to approximately 60 meters and improving armor protection, but it remained constrained by the relatively modest fuel capacity that the vehicle itself could carry. German engineers never solved the trailer separation problem as cleanly as the British had with the Crocodile design, meaning their fuel remained vulnerable to the defensive fire they themselves were attracting. The American M4A3R3 Zippo, a Sherman tank modified to carry a flame projector in place of the main gun, was developed slightly later and used primarily in the Pacific Theater against Japanese island fortifications. Its range was comparable to the German systems at roughly 55 to 75 meters, and while it proved highly effective in the specific conditions of Pacific Island assaults, it lacked the range, armor protection, and fuel capacity of the Crocodile. American forces in the European theater largely relied on British Crocodiles provided through liaison arrangements where flame tank support was required, an implicit acknowledgement of the system's superiority within the European operational context. The Soviet Union also operated flamethrower tanks throughout the war primarily variants of the T-34 and KV series. But Soviet doctrine tended towards using these weapons differently, prioritizing area denial and the destruction of buildings rather than the targeted reduction of specific fortified emplacements. The Crocodile's particular contribution was tactical precision, combined with the standing capacity of the Churchill hull, to survive long enough in defended approaches to deliver that precision. No other nation system combined all three factors of range, survivability, and sustained fuel capacity as successfully. Assessing the Crocodile's actual historical impact requires separating the psychological from the material and being honest about the limitations of the available evidence. In purely material terms, the number of defensive positions physically destroyed by Crocodile fire was a small fraction of the total positions reduced during the Northwest Europe campaign. Artillery, conventional armor, infantry assault, and aerial bombardment all accounted for vastly more physical destruction. But the Crocodile's material record is not where its importance lies. Its importance lies in what it permitted that nothing else could. Certain categories of fortification, those that had survived everything else thrown at them, became vulnerable specifically because the Crocodile existed. And beyond that, its mere presence altered the calculus of German defensive planning and the behavior of German garrisons in ways that cannot be fully quantified but are consistent enough across the record to be taken seriously. The weapon influenced post-war development substantially. The Centurion-based Crocodile, adapting the same trailer concept to a newer tank hull, remained in British service into the 1960s. The concept of a purpose-designed armoured flame vehicle as a distinct category of tank destroyer, separate from infantry flamethrowers and from general-purpose tank armament, influenced the thinking of multiple nations' armoured corps during the early Cold War period. Several surviving Crocodile sets exist in museum collections today. The Tank Museum at Bovington in Dorset holds examples that are among the most complete surviving specimens, and the Imperial War Museum has related materials in its collection. Return for a moment to that beach in Normandy, to that morning in June, to the men who watched something they had never seen before lumber forward and do something a tank had never done before. What they witnessed was not simply a new weapon. It was the answer to a problem that had seemed, not many months earlier, entirely without a good solution. The problem of the hardened position, the concrete emplacement, the fortification designed to absorb everything that could be thrown at it, had haunted military planners since the lessons of the First World War had been written in the ground at Passchendaele and the Somme. The Crocodile did not solve that problem elegantly. It solved it absolutely. 150 meters of reach, 80 bursts of fire, 152 millimeters of frontal armor, keeping the crew alive long enough to use it. These numbers seem modest written down. They were not modest in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the streets of Caen, in the fortified port towns that fell faster than their garrisons had believed possible. The men who built it understood something that the men who built the Atlantic Wall had perhaps underestimated. Concrete stops bullets. Concrete stops shells. Concrete, it turns out, does not stop fire. Fire finds the gaps that everything else cannot. Fire goes where the defenders are, and fire, projected by a vehicle armored heavily enough to deliver it without being destroyed in the attempt, changes the terms of any engagement it enters. The Germans who saw it coming had a name for it, used in captured intelligence documents and prisoner of war interrogation records. They called it the Feuerspucker, the fire spitter. It is, as names go, accurate enough. But accuracy does not quite capture what it meant to be on the wrong end of it. The British Army knew what it had built, and in the summer and autumn and winter of 1944, as it drove east toward a Germany that was running out of concrete to hide behind, it used it.